"Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave." That single sentence, cold, dismissive, and shocking, cut through the loud applause echoing in the high school auditorium. Retired Marine Sergeant Major Elijah Thompson turned his head slowly, not sure he'd heard right. The booming cheer for his son's name was still ringing in his ears when he saw two uniformed security guards standing beside him. They weren't smiling. Their eyes darted nervously, as if they were embarrassed but determined to follow through. He stood tall in his Marine Corps dress blues, the ribbons and medals pinned on his chest glinting under the lights. His back was straight, boots polished, hands clasped gently in front of him. He had done nothing, said nothing, except quietly take his place at the back of the room, hoping not to cause a fuss. One of the guards leaned in closer and said it again, this time quieter. "We've had a couple complaints. Some guests feel uncomfortable. We're going to have to ask you to leave." Uncomfortable? Elijah's jaw tensed. He turned toward the stage, where his 18-year-old son Michael Thompson had just walked across to receive his diploma. The applause had died down, but Michael's eyes had caught the scene unfolding. From the stage, the young graduate stood frozen, confusion washing across his face. It wasn't hard to tell what was happening. He could see the guards. He could see his father, and he could see the tension. Elijah looked back at the guards. "Is there a problem?" One of them shifted uncomfortably. "It's just, we're trying to keep the environment safe and welcoming for everyone." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "And you think I'm a threat? Because I wore my uniform to my son's graduation?" Silence. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone spoke volumes. This was a man who had spent 25 years in service to his country. He had led Marines through the worst conditions imaginable. He had been in places where bullets flew and brothers fell. He had survived, endured, and returned, not just with scars, but with honor. He had missed birthdays, holidays, and years of his son's childhood in service of the very freedom this ceremony represented. And now, on the one day, he finally stood still. No battlefield, no orders, no radio in his ear. He was being asked to leave. Not for disrupting, not for causing a scene, but for making people uncomfortable. Perhaps it was his uniform. Perhaps it was his skin color. Perhaps it was the combination, a black man in a position of dignity, pride, and power, that made people uneasy. Elijah's eyes scanned the room. Most parents were oblivious, cheering on their children. But a few eyes were locked on him, watching, judging, whispering. He felt a lump rise in his throat, not from fear, but from something deeper. How many times had he stood between fear and freedom for people just like them? He thought about the years away from home, the brothers he'd lost, the silence of coming back to a country that still didn't quite know how to say thank you. And yet, he never stopped believing in the promise of America. Not because it was perfect, but because people like him kept showing up to make it better. He had chosen to sit in the back, not out of shame, but out of respect. He hadn't wanted to steal the spotlight from his son. This day was about Michael, about the kid who stayed up late studying while his father deployed overseas, about the son who wrote letters to Afghanistan that said, "I miss you, Dad. Come home safe." And now, here he was, about to be escorted out like a criminal, while his son stood on a stage full of dreams and confusion. But what neither Elijah nor the guards realized was that someone else had noticed. Actually, 6 people had noticed. 6 men seated a few rows ahead. They sat still for a moment, processing the injustice. They weren't school staff. They weren't family. They were something different. They were Navy SEALs. And they knew exactly who Elijah Thompson was. They had served with him, fought beside him, owed their lives to him. And as the guards moved one step closer to removing him, those 6 men slowly began to rise to their feet. To be continued in the next section. To the security guards, he may have looked like just another guest, an older black man in uniform, standing quietly in the back of the room. But they didn't know the story behind those eyes. They didn't know the weight of that uniform. And they certainly didn't know who they were speaking to. Retired Sergeant Major Elijah Thompson wasn't just any Marine. He was a legend among those who had served with him, a man known not just for his bravery, but for his unwavering integrity, calm under pressure, and dedication to those under his command. Born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, Elijah grew up in a time and place where people like him weren't expected to make it far. His childhood was surrounded by poverty, discrimination, and hard choices. But even then, Elijah showed something different. He was sharp, disciplined, and strong-willed. At 18, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, not just to escape, but to serve something bigger than himself. He wanted to fight for a future he still believed in, even when it didn't always fight for him. He served for 25 years, rising through the ranks with quiet excellence. He completed deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and across the Middle East. He was known for leading by example, never asking his Marines to do something he wouldn't do himself. Elijah had seen war at its worst. He had pulled wounded soldiers from burning Humvees. He had marched through the desert with no sleep for days. He had written letters to families after losing men in combat. He had been the steady hand in the chaos, the kind of leader others prayed would be on their team. He earned 2 Purple Hearts after being wounded in combat, a Bronze Star for valor, and the kind of respect that no ribbon could ever measure. But for Elijah, the hardest thing wasn't war. It was being away from his son. Michael was only a toddler when Elijah left for his first deployment. Over the years, he missed birthdays, football games, school plays. He carried that guilt more than any battlefield scar. But he also carried every drawing Michael sent him. Crayon sketches of tanks and helicopters that said, "I love you, Dad." When Elijah finally retired, he promised himself one thing. No matter what, I'll be at his graduation. Not just to cheer, but to show Michael what honor looks like. To wear his dress blues with pride. To stand tall as a father, not just a Marine. And now, that moment had arrived. But instead of a celebration, he was being treated like a threat. To some, his uniform might have been intimidating. To others, his skin color made them suspicious. But none of that erased what he had done for this country. He stood in that auditorium, not seeking recognition, but out of love for a son who had waited years for his father to come home, and for a man who had done everything right, only to be told he didn't belong. And all the while, Michael stood on stage watching. The joy that filled his face seconds earlier had vanished. He looked down from the stage, diploma in hand, scanning the crowd, confused and anxious. It didn't take long for him to spot the guards and his father. Something inside him broke. Was this really happening? On his big day? To the man he had admired more than anyone? The moment should have been about pride. Instead, it was becoming a humiliation. And not just for Elijah, but for everyone who ever wore a uniform and returned to a country that sometimes forgot their sacrifice. But Elijah didn't yell. He didn't argue or cause a scene. He simply stood still, not as a victim, but as a man who had stared down far worse and survived with grace. What the guards couldn't see was that this man had once stared into the eyes of enemy soldiers and never blinked. And he wasn't alone, because seated just a few rows ahead were 6 men who owed Elijah everything. 6 former Navy SEALs who had served with him in the worst parts of the world. Men who had been pulled out of hell by his leadership. Men who had watched him risk his life not once, but many times for others. And as they realized what was happening, what kind of man was being disrespected in front of an entire school, they began to rise. Quiet, focused, unmistakable. Brothers don't sit back and watch injustice happen, especially not to the man who once stood in front of bullets for them. They weren't about to let him stand alone again. To be continued in Section 3. The auditorium was full, but the energy in the room had shifted. What had started as a proud celebration of achievement was now clouded by a tension that was quietly boiling at the back of the room. A father, a Marine, was being asked to leave his son's graduation, not for speaking out, not for causing a disruption, but for simply being there in uniform and in the wrong skin. And just as the guards inched forward to try and escort him out, 6 men stood up at once, without a word, without hesitation. Their movements were slow, deliberate. They wore no uniforms, no ribbons, but you could feel it in how they moved. These men were warriors, former Navy SEALs. They had arrived separately. They hadn't come to be noticed. Some wore jeans, others button-down shirts. They blended in with the crowd, seated quietly among the other parents and families. But they all had one thing in common. They were here for Elijah, not because they were invited, not because they were part of the ceremony, but because of a bond that civilians rarely understand. Elijah Thompson had saved their lives. Somewhere between Afghanistan's dusty mountains and Iraq's deadly roads, this man had risked everything for them. When things went wrong, when the bullets came too fast, when the exits vanished, when the world collapsed, Elijah was the one who got them home. Commander Blake Carter, the first to rise, had served 2 tours with Elijah. Once, during a nighttime raid gone wrong, Carter had been pinned behind a burning vehicle. Bullets whizzed past him, radio silence, no way out, until Elijah, under heavy fire, dragged him 60 yards to cover, took a bullet to the leg, and still managed to return fire long enough to get the rest of the squad out. That wasn't in any headlines, but it lived in Carter's bones. As he approached the back of the room with his brothers close behind, the crowd began to murmur. Heads turned. The moment had become something different, something serious, something electric. The 2 security guards froze. They hadn't expected this. "Is there a problem here?" Carter asked calmly, standing shoulder to shoulder with Elijah. One of the guards opened his mouth, then closed it. The other looked around nervously. "This gentleman is being disruptive," one finally said. There were complaints. Carter narrowed his eyes. "From who?" Silence. "No one here has a problem with this man except the 2 of you." Another SEAL chimed in. Then Carter turned and spoke, not to the guards, but to the entire auditorium. His voice wasn't angry. It was measured, powerful, and full of authority. The kind that makes a room least. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? This man, Sergeant Major Elijah Thompson, is a decorated Marine who served this country for 25 years. He is a hero, a leader, and a father. And he is here today to watch his son graduate. Nothing more, nothing less." The room went still. Even students on stage stopped shifting in their seats. Teachers froze. Phones dropped to laps. Everyone listened. Carter continued. He didn't ask for recognition. He didn't ask for attention. He stood quietly in the back, in full uniform, because he wanted this moment to be about his son. And yet, here we are, watching 2 men try to remove him for reasons that have nothing to do with safety and everything to do with ignorance. Now the silence in the room was thick. People began to shift uncomfortably, realizing what was happening. A few gasps. One woman in the front row stood up, then another man near the aisle. And then, like a wave spreading across the auditorium, the entire audience began to rise to their feet. A standing ovation, not for the SEALs, not for the confrontation, but for Elijah. Even the principal, red-faced and visibly shaken, rushed over. "I had no idea this was happening," he whispered. This wasn't supposed to happen. But it had, and now everyone in that room had seen it. The quiet injustice, the public correction, the power of respect when it's defended loudly. As the applause grew louder, Michael ran from the stage into the audience, straight into his father's arms. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He just held on tight, diploma in hand, like he never wanted to let go. 6 SEALs stood around them, shielding the moment. Not with weapons, but with presence. Because some men fight on the battlefield. Others fight for dignity. And the greatest among them do both. Well, you could have heard a pin drop. For a few long seconds, the entire auditorium stood in stunned silence. Parents, students, teachers, even the custodians by the exit doors. No one moved. No one spoke. The air was thick with realization, shock, and something deeper, respect. It wasn't just about Elijah Thompson anymore. This moment had become about something much bigger. This was about every man and woman who had put on a uniform and come home to find that their service still wasn't enough to protect them from judgment. It was about the invisible line that still exists in places it shouldn't, schools, neighborhoods, and now, even graduation ceremonies. But here, in this room, that line had just been crossed and erased. Commander Carter, standing just behind Elijah, slowly raised his voice, not in anger, but with conviction. "This man doesn't need anyone to speak for him," he began. "But since someone decided to disrespect him, I'll gladly remind this room who he is." He turned, making eye contact with the crowd. Sergeant Major Elijah Thompson didn't just serve his country. He bled for it. He lost friends for it. He missed raising his son so all of our children could grow up free. And today, he came here simply to watch his boy graduate. But instead of honor, he was met with suspicion. Carter's voice cracked slightly, not with weakness, but with emotion, the kind that can't be rehearsed. A few audience members wiped tears from their eyes. Some of you clapped when his son's name was called. Now you know who raised that boy. A man of integrity. A man who stood for others long before anyone stood for him. Then he said something that stuck with everyone in that room long after the ceremony ended. The uniform doesn't stop protecting this country when the war is over, and neither do the people who wore it. Sergeant Major Thompson, sir, thank you, not just for your service, but for your patience, your presence, your example. The principal turned to the two guards, who were now staring at the floor in silence. The room watched as he escorted them away himself. No more whispers, no more arguments. They left without a word. The room turned its attention back to Elijah and Michael, still standing there. The father held his son tightly, Michael's cap slightly crooked from the embrace. The diploma, still in the boy's hand, now seemed to carry so much more weight. It wasn't just a certificate anymore. It was a symbol handshakes followed. A few hugs. A lot of nods. Michael stood by his father's side, proud, smiling wider than he had all day. The diploma he had earned seemed even more meaningful now, because it was handed to him on a day his father had to earn something too: basic human respect. Then the school's superintendent approached, escorted by the principal. "Sergeant Major Thompson," he said, his voice solemn. "What happened today is unacceptable. You deserve better.